Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for the 451 Research arm of S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be discussing Buy Now, Pay Later with Associate Analyst Michaela Wooldridge. Michaela, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Eric. I'm excited to be here.
Well, it's great to have you, and especially to extend the conversation that we've been doing around payments. You know, Jordan McKee's been on talking about some of the specifics about what we've been doing in the sort of the core payments aspects. We talked a little bit about some of the evolution of this market in general, but we haven't dug into some of the mechanics of things like Buy Now, Pay Later. So before we dive in too deeply, let's start off with, can you tell us what Buy Now, Pay Later is and how does it work?
Absolutely. So Buy Now, Pay Later is short-term financing that's positioned as an alternative to credit. So with Buy Now, Pay Later, I could go online, purchase something, and pay for it over time in a series of installments.
So if we think about some of the ways in which merchants have been handling credit, I mean, we've had things like layaway programs, historically, or ways to be able to not have to establish credit, but still be able to get access to merchandise, to basically have a merchant structured way to be able to do that time payment. I mean, that's pretty early days. How did Buy Now, Pay Later get started? Or I'll shift to the acronym, the BNPL. And what's it really turned into today?
It's a great question because it's based off of a fairly old concept, layaway, like you mentioned. And layaway was really offered during the Great Depression as a means to make items a little bit more affordable for consumers during hard times and helped increase sales. And with layaway, a consumer could take an item to the customer service desk, set up a payment plan, and then pick up the item once it was paid off in full. And credit cards really did away with layaway. Credit cards were just a more convenient alternative. You could walk away with the item in hand and then pay it off at a later date. And Buy Now, Pay Later really brings the concept of layaway to e-commerce. And that's really how it got started. Klarna and Afterpay were the two early movers in this space. Klarna brought Buy Now, Pay Later to the Nordics around 2006, and then Afterpay followed in the Australian market around 2014. And since then, it's expanded globally, and we see it now across many different regions and also different verticals as well. It's not just focused on the retail vertical like it was originally. We're seeing it in travel, in healthcare, even in grocery. So it's really just diversified.
Well, and it sounds like you've turned the traditional layaway model somewhat on its head in that you actually get the thing up front and then have those structured payments afterwards.
Exactly. And the benefit of it for consumers has been the flexibility. Consumers like it because they can walk away with the item and they can pay it off over time. It allows them to afford an item that they may not have the funds to pay for up front, and they can try out an item without financially committing in full. There's a few different models with Buy Now, Pay Later that I think are worth mentioning. One, the Pay in 4 model lets you split payments into 4 equal installments, and these are typically interest-free. Then there's the try before you buy model that lets a consumer order something and then have 30 days to either return it or pay for it. And then there's longer term financing plans that typically do involve interest.
This is an area in which, I mean, it's relatively new, but yet there seems to be significant adoption. And we've got data from both sides of this market, both from the end consumer side as well as the merchant side, that you've been writing about.
Absolutely. We are seeing strong adoption. We found that a quarter of consumers have made a purchase using Buy Now, Pay Later in this past 6 months. And that actually jumps to a little over half of Gen Z and about 42% of millennials, according to our Voice of the Connected User Landscape Q3 2021 survey. And really, it's the younger consumers, like I mentioned, that are using this more so than their older counterparts. Merchant adoption is also strong. We've seen about 40% almost of merchants surveyed do currently offer Buy Now, Pay Later. And then another 40% are in the discovery phase or are planning to implement it in the next 12 months, according to our 2022 merchant survey. And merchants like it because it helps them potentially increase their conversions. So they are making, a sale that they may not have otherwise. It helps them increase their average order value. So customers are actually spending more at checkout. And it also helps them potentially boost their customer acquisition. So they're attracting that younger demographic that wants to use buy now, pay later. And it also enables them to deepen customer loyalty with consumers as well. And when we asked merchants what their returns on investment are, over 70% strongly agreed that it is increasing their conversions and is increasing their customer acquisitions and also boosting their average order value. So definitely strong returns here.
Wow. So, I mean, it sounds like really you've got strong consumer demand, especially around Gen Z and millennials, strong merchant buy in. What could possibly go wrong, right? This is great. With the exception that there seems to be a certain amount of turbulence in the market, right?
That's a great point. There definitely is a little bit of a dark side with buy now, pay later. And really, one of the biggest concerns is that it's contributing to overspending. So consumers may be taking on more than they can afford. And we've actually found that 1 in 5 Gen Z say that they're rarely or never on time with their buy now, pay later payments, according to our Voice of the Connected User Landscape Q3 2021 survey.
Ooh, ouch. Yeah.
Yeah,
Because that starts to open that door of, is this really a credit problem? And I guess the question now is, who's on the hook for it?
another great question. So if a consumer defaults, then the buy now, pay later provider is typically on the hook. They usually take on the liability with buy now, pay later if there's an issue with things like fraud, but that's not always the case. So a merchant that is considering pursuing buy now, pay later may want to do their due diligence on who that's going to fall on, because we've also found that consumers tend to blame the merchant if they experience an issue with their payment card.
Yeah, because it seems like this is something where, again, there's that transfer of blame that takes place that we see in so many aspects of technology pieces. But yeah, I think you pointed out an important part, which is the fact that there do seem to be some providers that are also picking up fraud, which, in a lot of cases in retail, for credit card transactions, that fraud risk winds up being placed on the merchant themselves. So this is, I guess, is that enough to be something that's also an attractive benefit to merchants, or is that something that's really still in transition enough?
I would say it has been an attractor for merchants, but really what's driving a lot of the activity from a merchant standpoint has been the chance for increased conversions and average order value and the chance to engage with a younger demographic. I would say those have been the primary selling points with buy now, pay later.
So this really is spread that peak of the cost of the purchase and help to incentivize the buying process itself.
Exactly.
I guess I'm sort of wondering about the players in the market. There, of course, is interestingly enough, we'd scheduled this a while back before Apple had made the announcement that they were going to jump into BNPL. But we've also had Klarna say that they're laying off staff. These seem to be some sort of mixed messages. I guess, who's out in the market? Who do you see out there? Who are those players? And what do you think the state of the market is?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. And really, one of the big things that we've been seeing is just there's a lot more players entering the space. We're seeing more fintechs come out with their own offerings. We're seeing banks launch their own offerings. So, for example, Citibank launched Citizens Pay. And like you said, Apple just announced their plans to launch Apple Pay Later, which would allow users to split payments into 4 interest-free installments. So there's a lot of interest in this space, but there's a little bit of a dark side. Like I mentioned, concerns with consumer ability to pay has been a big concern. And then also rising interest rates are putting pressures on buy now, pay later providers' margins. And that also leads into, like you mentioned, Klarna laying off 10% of its workforce. They're trying to cut costs. They also have massive marketing expenses, a lot of these consumer-facing providers. And it's a little bit of rough waters for providers at this time. there's some concerns that Apple is going to put some pressure on the current providers just because it's lending off its own balance sheet. And it is also integrated with so many merchants that it really is going to potentially put pressures on the existing players in the market.
Oh, yeah. So it winds up basically reducing friction for consumers because, hey, if you're paying with Apple Pay and you just do pay later, off you go. Um, but there are a couple different pieces to this. I was curious. You were talking about the amount that Klarna and others spend on marketing, and I'm curious about the direction of that. I guess for the vendors in the BNPL world, who are they selling to? Is it something where they're working primarily to attract consumers? Because you'd say maybe Apple was already in that realm, or are they targeting merchants to be able to identify that, hey, here's a valuable addition to the payment process? Where does that head, and who are those? Who's making those decisions in BNPL markets?
We've seen several go-to-market strategies. Certainly, securing merchant and lending relationships is important for providers, but some are more consumer facing than others. The larger providers like Klarna, for instance, are much more consumer facing. So they're actually going directly to consumers and building their own customer experience and driving engagement early on in the purchasing process. Securing partnerships with payment processors and e-commerce platforms is another strategy we're seeing. For example, Stripe partnered with Afterpay to enable its merchants to offer buy now, pay later, and Affirm also secured a partnership with Shopify. Then there's a completely white label approach that we're seeing where providers are actually going directly to merchants and banks to enable them to build out their own branded offering. And this is a trend we're seeing more providers move towards. Split It, for example, is now pursuing a white label offering. And this has been a key attractor for larger merchants we found that want to own their customer experience. And that's something that merchants should consider. If they want to go with a big logo like Klarna, they can tap into their customer base, but will likely cede some of that control over the customer experience. Whereas if they go with a provider that can offer them their own branded solution, they're going to have much more control over that customer experience.
Yeah, this is something that Jordan had gotten into in a lot of his discussions about integrating finance into environments, into the purchase process itself. It's really that decision from the merchant, and now the opportunity to be able to own more of that entire purchasing path.
Exactly.
So I guess when you think about a lot of the benefits, a lot of the things that are really taking place in the market and its transformation, what do you think are some of the current challenges with BNPL and where it's headed? I guess we've identified maybe a few of them, but you touched on some of the pieces about concerns about consumer behavior and some of what the ramifications that may shake out there, some of the merchant concerns. What are some of those aspects that organizations should keep in mind?
Well, for one, it's a very saturated market right now. There's a lot of different offers and somewhat of a lack of standardization, which can be confusing for consumers. Merchants should consider ways they can streamline the buying process and work with providers to communicate clear terms and conditions to consumers. Merchants will also want to consider if the cost is worth the benefits. So, buy now, pay later transaction fees can be quite high. They can be around 2 to 8% plus a fixed fee in some cases, which can be higher than the 2 to 3% average credit card discount rate. Providers also want to make sure they aren't contributing to overspending. So, setting caps on late fees or removing late fees entirely is something we've seen more providers move towards. And given the saturation that's facing this market, providers should expect and prepare for increased consolidation. We put out some recent reports on M&A activity, and we found that there's been 35 billion in deal value spent on buy now pay later since 2019, and some of this is inflated by Block's $29 billion acquisition of Afterpay. But I think we're going to see increased consolidation, and that's something the market should prepare for.
Oh, wow. Well, it sounds like a situation where when you've got something where you've got a technology that consumers use, see as a valuable part of what is the purchasing process, there are a lot of significant motivations in terms of just that value. So if you've got a market that actually has the cash to be able to push some of those transactions forward, here's an opportunity where there's something that's we've got demand in consumers, we've got demand in merchants, and something where some channel consolidation starts to look like a pretty attractive option. And with that level of transaction activity, sounds like there could easily be more. So I guess we'll have to keep an eye on the markets in terms of where they go. I want to dig into one of the things you'd mentioned about some of the consumer aspects of this. Is buy now, pay later regulated in the same way that credit cards are? I mean, credit cards have historically been under significant amounts of regulation. There's a lot of other consumer financing, that there's a lot of regulation that covers. Is it covered in the same way?
That is a great question. It's actually not, and that is one of the concerns as well. It's not considered credit in the legal sense, and that's really for some of the split pay options, the pay in four options with interest. There's a little bit more regulation that's subject to that. But we've actually found that the market's getting a lot of regulatory scrutiny. So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau just launched an inquiry into buy now, pay later. The Australian government also announced plans to regulate it. And the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK established some guidelines for buy now, pay later providers. So this is also something that we can expect more of. We can expect more consumer protections and regulatory guardrails in the space.
Well, I mean, you talked about probably one of the larger concerns, something like late fees, but of course, you've got this whole complex relationship in the transaction that's taking place. Because, hey, if everything goes wonderfully, really simple, pay in whatever your term happens to be, but things get complicated when you then get a situation in which you get, partial payments, late payments. You'd call that our stats that, what was it, 1 in 5 identify that they're never on time? Was
One
that
in
the
five
number?
Gen Z.
Well, yeah. Okay, so and in that situation, then the question is, how significant are the late fees? What do you get? Do you have to return the merchandise if you don't pay? Do complete payment? All those things that we saw in layaway markets, and that have always been part of that transactional piece. So that, I guess, a lot that we need to sort through there.
It can quickly get complex, definitely, and merchants, they offer it because they want to provide a better customer experience. They want to give consumers the payment options that they're looking for. And that can really backfire, especially if there's too many logos at checkout and if there's, too confusing terms, if returns aren't handled in a timely manner. That's all going to negatively impact the customer experience.
Oh, and then it starts getting into a lot of things that Cheryl Kingstone's been talking about ensuring that you've got as friction-free as possible a customer interaction, and all this stuff has to be interconnected at the back end to ensure that that consumer experience is as smooth and pain-free as possible.
Absolutely.
So, what's next for BNPL, and what should organizations be considering around its use and capabilities?
I think there's a lot in store for this market. We've seen a lot of diversification across verticals and more players entering the space. I think we're going to see that continue. One of the big trends we've been seeing is financial institutions launching their own offerings. Buy now, pay later used to be considered a threat to banks' credit and lending businesses, but they're seeing it more of a complementary product now. And they also have a bit of a competitive advantage here. They can potentially lend off their own balance sheet. They have those customer relationships and data on consumer ability to pay. So I think that they're in a really good position to offer buy now, pay later, and I think we'll see more banks entering the space. We're also seeing increased interest in B2B buy now, pay later. So Klarna, for example, partnered with a German B2B provider, Billy, for example, and there's a little bit of a different value proposition here where it's more about managing cash flow for businesses, which has been attractive given the supply chain issues and inflation. And I think we're going to see increased investment in the B2B space. Also, like I mentioned earlier, I think we're going to see increased consumer protections in the form of stronger ability to pay checks, and also having businesses lean on artificial intelligence and machine learning to get better insight into consumer financial health, for example. I think merchants are going to move towards dynamically presenting financing offers to consumers at checkout and presenting offers that they're qualified for based on their purchase history. This can pretty much help with not only preventing irresponsible spending, but it also is a way to give consumers a more personalized experience. And lastly, like I touched on earlier, I think we're going to see an increase in M&A activity. So providers are looking to differentiate themselves and provide things like rewards at checkout. And we've seen Klarna pursue some acquisitions to enable that. Banks are also acquiring to enable buy now, pay later. So Goldman Sachs acquired GreenSky, for example, to build out their offering. And really, it's becoming integrated into a broader suite of financial services is the overarching theme here.
So this really expands from that basic transaction piece to, as we keep talking about, integrating all of those relationships. And I guess now, to your point, consumer and business side as well. I guess we'll have to go see what's in store and what's online. I had to get the dad joke in there. So this has been great. And especially as we look into a lot of these complexities in interactions and payments more broadly. So thank you for all the information. I will advise our listeners to go take a look at some of the research, dig into some of the vocal and merchant studies. But Michaela, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Eric.
And that's it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us, and thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright, Katerina Iacoviello, Ethan Zimmon on the marketing and events teams, and our studio lead, Kyle Cagnulosi. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we'll be heading into a review of what we've seen this year and what lies ahead in technology. Some of our research focus and really what we're going to be looking at as we start rolling towards the end of the year. Yeah, as the end of the year is still looming. So I hope you'll join us to shake out what that is with Simon Robinson, head of research. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.